Hey, good evening, everybody. Dave Valente. Thank you for joining us on the Political Deep Dive. You'll notice a little bit of different this evening. There is no guest. I am the guest, I guess you could say. We're going to be talking about the history of U.S. and Iranian relations. This issue crops up every once in a while. And in fact, over the last few weeks, we've heard some rumblings out of Iran about continuing nuclear enrichment and expanding nuclear enrichment. Uh, uh, Usually, when a new president comes in, there is a challenge to their foreign policy chops, and perhaps Iran will be a challenge. So, we're going to talk about this. I'm going to give you kind of a build up to what led to how why Iran behaves the way it does, and why they have enmity towards the United States, why we have enmity towards Iran. Um, and kind of give you an idea of the things that we do in the Middle East are the same things that Iran is trying to do in the Middle East. We're not as innocent or as guilty as Iran. We're kind of doing the same thing. So let me kick off the presentation. Yes, I'm a frustrated wannabe college professor. So you're getting a PowerPoint, and really, it's not really just a PowerPoint. Just to I'm going to read off of it. Really, it's just going to keep me on track to hit the highlights and the points that I want to hit. Um, so let's take a look. What let's start with the bottom line up front. What do each side want? Uh, Iran wants the right to self determination, and as we'll see throughout their history, that's been a big issue. They have not had the ability to determine their own path forward as a country, especially over the last few centuries. So they want freedom from foreign influence in domestic affairs. It's a common, hey, the United States wants the same thing. We've had issues with, hacking and Russian interference in elections and all that fun stuff. The other thing, stop being threatened. Right now, the United States has foreign bases all around the Iranians. So there is definitely a threat to their territorial integrity, to their sovereignty. And then the final one is kind of a goal thing for them is to be respected as a regional power. They want to be the kind of that dominant regional hegemon. Um, it's going to put them at odds with the United States because the United States, as you see at the bottom there, wants to be respected as the superpower in the region. Uh, you know, the United States wants to get Iran out of the idea of using proxies to foment either Iranian revolution or Islamic revolution, or just to destabilize the region. As we're seeing in Yemen, as we saw in the 80s in Lebanon, they have used quite a bit of their uh, money, technical advice, things like that to non-state actors that have destabilized the region quite well. We have as well. Uh, and the United States wants the uninterrupted flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. Whether it's if we can come to an agreement with Iran, uh, Iranian oil will be fine. If it's just the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. If those are the places that we have to get the oil from, that's fine. But they want the uninterrupted flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. So as we move to discovering why, what has led to Iran having an issue with foreign domination, we have to look at the Qajari dynasty. Uh, Qajari dynasty ruled from like late 1700s until 1925. The Qajari dynasty was kind of passed back and forth between Russia and Britain in the balance of power politics. So, you know, back before the world wars, the balance of power was, countries would take suzerainty over other countries. So, like the Ottomans with Greece, and Britons would try and foment issues in Greece, Egypt as well. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was kind of a big source of all of this, but you know, Iran was kind of passed back and forth. And it usually was regarding like agricultural things. Like Iran was a big supplier of tobacco. In fact, there was a revolution based on tobacco in the late 1800s. Um, but as we go forward, the into the 20th century, oil becomes the big issue. Countries are looking for sources of oil. We're industrializing. We're building cars now. Flight is starting to take flight, um, and so oil becomes a much more uh, lucrative thing to have as a country. And there was rumors that Iran was flush with oil. A gentleman named William Darcy sought a concession from the Iranian government, basically promised to pay them to what is the equivalent about $2 million now, and then the company that is would be set up would give Iran 16% of the profits that were identified by the company conveniently enough. Um, as we move into World War I, and we talk about how the importance of oil to the war effort was paramount in World War I. Not as much as it would be in World War II, but in World War I is very very important. As we build tanks, we build cars, early planes. It does become a central issue for the war effort. In 1917, the Russians kind of take a step back as they go through their own revolution. We go from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union by 1921. Um, and in this vacuum, the Brits step up and take over a lot of things in Iran. One of the things they take over is something called the Persian Cossacks. And I'm using Iran. We'll get into the name change. At this point, they're called the Persian Dynasty or the Persian Empire, um, the Qajari Dynasty of the Persian Empire. Uh, they do change their name, and we'll get into that in a moment. But so they take over the Persian Cossacks, and one of the things that the Russians did with the Persian Cossacks is they staffed it with Russian military leaders. It was Russian military leaders, and all the soldiers, the grunts, were Persians. Um, so that changes when Britain takes over the Persian Cossacks, and they install not only British leaders, but they put in some Iranian leaders. And one of those gentlemen that they put in as a colonel was a man named Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi is very capable. He rises quickly through the ranks and assists in putting down several revolts in the northern part where uh, Soviet loyalists were in, the Azeri part of the country and the Kurdish part of the country, puts down those revolts. And then he comes down and they take Tehran, forces the Qajari Shah into exile. I believe he goes to Britain, and the Qajari Shah at this point is a very young kid, and was in no power to resist what was going on at the time. Pahlavi becomes, the head of the minister of war, and then eventually becomes the prime minister of Iran in I believe 1922. And this festers, this whole thing where the Shah has, left and gone to England, festers for 3 years, and finally finally Reza Pahlavi convinces the parliament. It's called the Majlis in Iran. It's the constituent parliament in Iran. He convinces them to depose the Shah and install him as the Shah. One politician who did speak out against the idea of Reza Pahlavi becoming the Shah was uh, was a parliamentarian named Mohammad Mossadegh. Um, he he wanted to create a constitutional monarchy within Iran. He thought that Pahlavi would have been better served to remain as the prime minister, but Pahlavi wanted the power, and he became the Shah. That was 1925. So the Qajari dynasty ends after about 200 years, and the Pahlavi house begins. Um, in 1928, they really start to agitate for a renegotiation of the concession, the Darcy concession, and the Brits aren't having it. They're like, you guys signed a contract. It's a 50-year contract. You guys just got to deal with your contract. It is to note that Americans have a very limited role in Persian affairs at this point. They do have a couple of advisors that played a semi-prominent role as we go to the 21 revolution, but they are eventually marginalized and sent out. Um, m- Really, it becomes Britain's domain. In the 1930s, things start to come to a head because Pahlavi realizes that Iran has been passed back and forth by the Russians, and he wants to kind of balance everything out. He wants to have more voices in the room, and rather than just dealing with the Brits. The Brits are bringing in the Russians again, um, but Pahlavi wants the Germans to take a larger role in the country, so they send over advisors, and it's not a big issue at the beginning of the decade, but as the decade wears on, we know what happens in Germany. Hitler takes over in 33, and it just becomes, as the tensions boil over in Europe, this becomes kind of untenable, relationship that you have Russia, Germany, and England fighting for Iran's attention. And at this point, this is when Persia becomes Iran on the world stage. The Shah of Reza Shah decides to call. He puts out an edict saying that from now on we are Iran. Iran is a local term for the country. There is consternation about it because it means land of the Aryans, and as you know, with the Germans, uh, they got real keen with that. So um, there was some worry that there were a lot of uh, loyalties. Where were the loyalties of the Shah? Um, and as the tensions simmer over into actual shooting war, it becomes even a greater issue. Oil is central to the growing to this war effort, and had Germany been able to pull Iran into their sphere of influence and kick out the Germans or kick out the British and the Soviets, we may be talking about Iran winning or I'm sorry, Germany winning World War II. That because not only was it a big source of the oil, there was a growing need for armies marching across Europe and navies going across the sea, but it was also a massive lend lease program route between to the Soviets, who were at this point early 1941 fighting against the Nazis for their very existence. So it becomes even more important, and just the mere presence of German uh, advisors becomes too much, and the English and the Soviets, the Brits and the Soviets decide to invade. Um, August 25th, 1941, the Soviets, despite having to fight the Nazis on the western part of their country and the Nazis pushing deep, uh, they send a brigade down to invade, and they get into the Azeri part of Iran, the Kurdish part of Iran. They're advancing a little slower. The Brits secure the oil field in Abadan and that region, making sure that the oil is secure. Um, and it takes a while for them to get into Tehran, but on September 15th, they do finally get into Tehran, and they force the abdication of Reza Shah on September 17th, 1941. Shah was sent to South America. He died 3 years later in exile, having never returned to Iran. They did fly the body back and was buried there, but he never personally returned to Iran. Um, One of the things that the Brits wanted to do was to return the Qajari dynasty because the Qajari dynasty had been very, very malleable to their interests. So, and excuse me, I'm trying to make sure that I got the any questions you guys are posing. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, either on Facebook. It's a little easier if you do it on the YouTube channel because I can see the comments that come through, but I'll do my best to make sure I pay attention to you guys' questions. I really appreciate everyone for joining me tonight. But they wanted the Qajari dynasty back because they were very malleable to the British interests. Unfortunately, the Shah that had been deposed had pretty much grown up in England and did not speak Farsi, which is the language of Iran, and was not a suitable candidate to come back. The Iranian advisors to the that were sympathetic to the invasion suggested that uh, instead of going back to the Qajaris, why don't we take the crown prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and name him the Shah? He's 21 years old. He's young. He's malleable. We can work with him. And so the Brits agree. The Brits and the Russians agree. And Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi uh, plays ball. He cuts an alliance with the USSR and the UK. During the invasion, most of the German technical advisors were smuggled out by Reza Shah. So there wasn't, a kick out of German technical advisors. It was just, that it was a commitment to the British and Soviet war effort. And later in 1941, the United States moves in as well. Um, so, again, we're looking at this, and you're seeing massive interference in Iranian politics. Basically not really caring who's in charge, just as long as they're malleable to the international war effort. And take a look at some of the questions. Do I have to watch these in order? No, you do not have to watch the deep dive in order. We do various topics. So Jackson Passananti, thank you for dropping in. But yeah, this is just me talking. So, and there's no rhyme or reason to all my broadcasts. It's different topics each week. So, thank you for dropping in. So let's talk about Mohammad Mossadegh, and this is the post-war period. There was general cooperation within Iran during the war between the Majlis and the Shah and the UK and Soviets and the Americans. Um, After the war, the Majlis wants to assert more power. They really want that idea of having a constitutional monarchy like Britain has. They have a head of state, ceremonial monarch, but the head of government is the prime minister, and they're the ones that make the decision. Uh, Mohammad Mossadegh, who spoke out against Reza Shah becoming Shah, uh, returns to he had left politics after the Pahlavi dynasty took power, and was a legal scholar and lawyer in Tehran. He returns to politics with a National Front Party. National Front Party is a conglomeration of different interest groups within Iran. Whether it's Democratic Socialist and workers' rights and things like that. They campaigned hard on the idea of nationalizing the oil. It becomes a big issue, and it really does kind of become the issue that they can hang their hat on and grows in popularity. Uh, they unwittingly helped by the United States in 1949 when the United States negotiated a contract with the Saudis for their oil and the company that would eventually become Saudi Aramco. The concession for that one was based on a 50-50 split of profits. When the Iranians caught wind of it, they were like, "Why can't we have this? We're getting a mandatory minimum off the renegotiation, uh, but we're not getting what we deserve. We were the backbone of the war effort. We should get more for our oil." Um, so all this builds and builds and builds, and in 1951, National Front becomes the majority party in parliament. They send forward a recommendation that Mohammad Mossadegh become the prime minister of Iran, and the Shah ascends to that on April 28th, 1951. It takes them 3 days to nationalize the oil. The bill is put through the parliament and it's passed, and Iranian oil is now nationalized. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is politely asked to leave and step back. Um, there's lots of things that are talked about with Mohammad Mossadegh. I mean, is kind of lionized because of what happens to him. He was not a perfect leader. He was not a perfect democratic leader at all. But because of what happens to him, his legend kind of grows throughout the year, and people have feelings about him that may not be completely accurate to what he was. Um, but as predictable, Britain seeks redress of what happens. They initiate a blockade. And really, it's not a blockade. They didn't just dump a bunch of ships into the Persian Gulf and prevent Iran from doing anything. All they had to do was take their Anglo-Iranian personnel, the expat personnel, out of the country, because one of the hallmarks of British oil is that they would staff all of the technical positions with expats, um, and the grunt work would be done by locals. And this was the case in Iran. So when they took off, when they let, when all the expats left, when things started breaking down, as they, when you're operating heavy machinery in a desert, that it's going to break down. They didn't have anybody that would really had the technical ability. They weren't able to get parts to replace. So oil just grinds to a halt for Iran. All that revenue that they're expecting uh, is no longer flowing, and that 1950 they drag out 254 or 240 billion barrels of oil, and 1953 the first year or 52 the first year after the nationalization, it's down to 10.6. And even if they had been able to maintain that level of oil production, if they dragged out 240 billion in 1952, the Brits had successfully blockaded all the oil markets from not accepting Iranian oil. They also got other oil companies to sign off on not assisting Iran in helping them drag out that oil. So um, that was the effective part of the blockade, is that no one was willing to play ball with Iran. Um, Now, the Brits were also doing a full court press. They wanted the International Court of Justice to intervene. The International Court of Justice really talks, they're disputes between countries. That's their uh, uh, that's their area. Mossadegh was actually very successful in arguing that this was not a disagreement between countries. It was a disagreement between a country and an international company, and that the ICJ did not have jurisdiction over them. And they agreed. ICJ refused to intervene in the issue. The Brits turned to the United States. At this point, Harry Truman is president. Truman refuses. He has his own issues with the Korean War going on at that point, and didn't want to be sidelined with dealing with Iran as well. But what they do is they help negotiate a settlement. They negotiate a settlement with Mohammad Mossadegh, who was in Washington at the time for meetings. Uh, the only issue was that the Brits weren't at the table because they were transitioning governments, and Winston Churchill was about to come back in and be prime minister of Britain in the 50s. And Winston Churchill took one look at the agreement and said no. They signed an agreement. It's a 50-year, or I'm sorry, the renegotiation of the agreement extended to 60 years. Would have ended naturally in 1993. But he maintained the idea that you sign the agreement, you honor your contract. Um, so we move on. 1952, Dwight Eisenhower is elected, takes office in January 53. If you remember back then, or throughout, if you study history, at that point there's a massive anti-communist fervor in Washington. McCarthy is really starting to take hold, and the hearings are starting. Eisenhower himself is a massive anti-communist. Um, so the administration that he puts in place is very amenable to the idea that we need to take out the communists. So the Churchill administration starts to put the plug in the ear of a man named John Foster Dulles, who becomes the head of the CIA. And Dulles begins to hatch a plan to intervene in Iran. It's more of a soft plan at this point. His point person in Iran is a gentleman named Kermit Roosevelt. He is the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. Um, he's very aggressive. trying to change the Iranians back to, you know, giving the Brits back their oil and all that stuff. So he's fully on board with whatever we're going to hatch. Um, so the Brits and the Americans run disinformation campaigns uh, out of the embassies. Some of the cash is exchanged, paying off certain members of the parliament and things like that. Mossadegh, at this point, we're 2 years into the embargo, and money is running out. People are suffering, and his popularity is suffering. It's going down the tubes. He's lost the support of the Shiite clerics, with which he had kind of built early support with, because their members were suffering. A lot of the poor people were most fervent Shiite adherents, and so they were suffering. And the Shiite clerics withdrew their support, so he was looking for other people to support, and he looked to a party called the Two Day Party. And the Two Day Party is fairly infamous in Iranian history as the Communist Party in in Iran. And this plays absolutely into the Brits' plans. It proves to the Americans that Mossadegh is at least a communist sympathizer, and there's a chance that Iran is going to go into the Soviet sphere of influence. Um, so they decided to do more aggressive campaign under the code name in the United States of Operation Ajax. In Britain, it was called Operation Boot because they don't come up with really good names in Britain, I guess. Um, but Mossadegh, what triggers it is that Mossadegh decides to dissolve Parliament, and uh, his plan becomes that he and his ministers, his handpicked ministers, would serve and make decrees, and it's basically rule by decree. He has become what he sought to destroy, basically an autocrat at this point. That's why I say that Mossadegh's history is a little more clouded than some of the people portray him to be as this great defender of democracy. He was to a point, but then he didn't. He fell into a trap. Um, at this point, they kick off Operation Ajax. And they convince the U.S. convinces um, the Shah to fire Mossadegh. So he sends what is called a firman, which is a royal decree, to dismiss Mossadegh and name General Faziola Zahedi to be the prime minister of Iran. The person that got to deliver that message was the head of the royal guards for the Shah. Mossadegh heard the firman, looked at him, and said, "You're under arrest." He refused to stand down, arrested the head of the royal guard. The Shah hears this and freaks out, and he bolts off to uh, Baghdad for a couple days, and then finally goes on to Italy. At this point, within official Washington circles, there's discussions about, perhaps maybe we can, start to work with Mossadegh, and maybe if we give him some timely aid, that we can help smooth things over. But it doesn't. Uh, People are confused at this point. But Kermit Roosevelt redoubles his effort. He's like, "Man, I got you." Um, he goes out and starts bribing more officials. He involves the South Tehran mafia, uh, and basically buys a bunch of protesters. And the idea of the protesters were just to stir up the Two Day Party. The Two Day Party does have a long history of political violence within Iran, so they weren't really all that. It didn't take a whole lot of arm twisting to get them to join the party. So the hired protesters stir up the Two Day. The Two Day start attacking the symbols of the Shah, and that angers a lot of people. And then they start attacking the bazaars, which angers the business class, and it turns into a riot because everyday Iranians started coming into the street with improvised weapons and started beating the fool out of the Two Days. Um, the army at this point under General Faziola Zahedi, who was supposed to be the prime minister at this point, takes the advantage. Zahedi takes a group of tanks down the street that Mossadegh lives and fires shells into his house. Now, Mossadegh was not there; he had escaped earlier, but he was arrested a couple days later, and the coup was successful. At least successful in the terms that they wanted. Long term, not so much. Um, the return of the Shah. The Shah does return, but it takes a gentleman named General Norman Schwarzkopf, and I know a lot of people know that name. It's not him; it's his dad. His dad works for the CIA, and he flies to Italy, and he convinces the Shah to come back. He's like, "You got to come back," and the Shah is despondent at this point. He thinks that he's suffered the same fate as his father. He's a weak leader. He's never going to be respected. And then they tell him, "No, we got Mossadegh out, and they fought for you because they were attacking the symbols of your power." He's rumored to have uttered the words, "They do love me," and in agreeing to return to Iran. So he does. Days after Mossadegh is deposed, um, Mossadegh for himself is tried, uh, basically kangaroo trial. Um, he's tried, sentenced to death, and it becomes a common theme with the Shah that the high profile people that do things like a coup or something more grandiose, they're pardoned. So he commutes the sentence to the Shah. It turns into a 3 years solitary confinement, which is no picnic. And then he's under house arrest until his death when he died in 1967. So now the Shah is much more powerful. The oil is flowing again, and there's new terms for the oil. Instead of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which that title is now just dirt in Iran. They, they changed their name to British Petroleum, but a consortium takes the oil. It's Royal Dutch Shell, the French oil company. I can't remember exactly what their name was, and then the five, along with British Petroleum, along with the five biggest American oil producers like Exxon Mobil, Texaco, those types of companies. Um, much more generous deal for the Shah, and so he gets that instant influx of cash into Iran to help alleviate some of those financial issues that they had going into with the embargo. Oil flows again. Now he has the money to help. The Shah is strengthened also by the CIA. Actually, this is a little bit inaccurate. The Sabak was created by the United States. Norman Schwarzkopf really taught them how to that early group of Savak agents how to do things. And Savak was the really brutally repressive secret police. Um, but we'll get into that. Eventually, do get trained by Mossad as well. But the early help was the United States CIA. The Shah tightens his grip on political dissent. Anybody who really gets this, is dissenting with the Shah, gets a visit from Sabak, probably some time in jail, and uh, there are people that get killed over it. And then the Shah is using that money to modernize the country. Um, there's still a system of feudalism in Iran at this point. There's a lot of things that need to be done. Let's see. Let me take a look at it and see if we got any questions. Nothing, but hey, feel free to dump me a question. I know this is a lot of information. This is all, I mean, this is where we start to see the United States get involved with Iran. Um, and it is that 53 coup, which is kind of that most pointed to flashpoint of why Iran or Iranians had distrust of the United States. And it does have knock-on consequences as we go through the time. But as we move into the 1960s, the Shah is really interested in change in the in Iran. His idea was what is called the White Revolution. Now, the White Revolution was a program of education, women's rights, land reform, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Uh, but the Ayatollah Khomeini, at this point, he has a history with the family here. He has a history with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's family. He is convinced that his dad killed his father when he was 5 years old, and he held that grudge to his dying day. Um, he was very active supporter in that Anglo-Soviet invasion because he was happy to get Reza Pahlavi out of the country. He campaigned against an idea called Westernization or capitulation, also known as West toxification in the Middle East. The idea that Western morals and values are starting to filter into the Islamic world, and you know they're tainting the Islamic culture of Iran or Saudi Arabia or Egypt, where this is a popular term all the way across the greater Middle East, in North Africa, that Western values taint the Islamic culture of that area. So he's very critical of that Westernization. He's critical of the edicts to that women can't wear the chador, which is the covering, the head covering, and the body covering of for the women in Iran. Um, at one point, Khomeini does a op-ed, um, basically calling the Shah the son of a dog, which makes sense if you think the dog in question is the person that killed your dad. But this enraged, uh, and in his Friday sermons, were caught and reported to the Shah, and so he becomes a political dissident. He's arrested. He's tried. He gets the death sentence, and the head of Sabak, ironically, the security services, intervened and said, killing Khomeini will only serve to inflame tensions. So he commuted the sentence. He spent a little time in jail, but then he was sent off to exile in the one of the holiest cities in Shiite Islam, which is called Najaf. It's in Iraq. You probably heard it while we were talking. When we discussed the first Iraq or the second Iraq War. Um, but he goes there and he's expecting a quiet retirement. He goes there to study um, at the mosque there. He really begins to think about political Islam and tying in Islam into government. How do you have an Islamic government? This is the stuff that he's starting to think about. He writes a book about political Islam, and it becomes banned but very popular within Iran. Um, but as I mentioned earlier, the Shah uses that oil revenue to modernize the country. He uses it for education. He does land reform, which ends feudalism in the country, which is a great idea. But unfortunately, they didn't have enough equipment to service the land that they were given. Each peasant was giving, I hate to use the word peasant, but each of the farmers were given a plot of land to farm, but they didn't have the equipment to do it. So basically, they were impoverished and they moved to the cities. They also did education reforms, promoting literacy between young and old alike. Uh, they didn't have enough schools to do it, so they employed religious schools, and this is kind of a bone to the clerics that, you know what, yeah, this is modernization. Maybe there are things that you don't like in this, but we're going to let you take that educational role, teach the people how to read and write. Um, so madrasas explode, and they explode primarily in these shanty towns that set up around Tehran and the big cities, because the farmers were forced off of their land because they didn't have the equipment to work it. Um, and really, this kind of sows some of the seeds of the Shah's eventual destruction. Despite being a modernizer and bringing in industry into Iran, this does not help. And then, of course, the other thing with with the reforms was the uh, and mostly the objectable part for it was the inclusion of women in democracy, allowing them the right to vote, allowing them to wear what they want to wear, be who they want to be. Um, that was a good thing of the white revolution, but it did push the clerical order away from the Shah. So let's talk about Savak. Savak, brutally repressive secret police from 1957 to 1979. They're trained by the CIA and Mossad. Mossad becomes involved a little bit later, but they train him in all the latest torture techniques and the bad stuff that you would expect from a secret police that deals with political prisoners. Iran had the highest number of political prisoners in the world, and that's kind of mind blowing when you think about there's the Soviet Union at the time, um, and other repressive regimes throughout the country. And maybe it's just because they didn't make them prisoners; they just shot them. I don't know, but that blows my mind. And it got so bad the torture. Yeah, Iran was frequently on the Human Rights Watch list, and the Shah would receive a lot of negative attention internationally regarding his human rights issues. But the issue became so bad they built this special prison in northern Tehran called Evin Prison, which is infamous for its torture, and it was expanded quickly from 300, uh, 320 capacity to 1,500 very quickly because they were just imprisoning that many people. It is important to note that the current Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was a political prisoner under the Shah, so he carries that institutional knowledge of what was going on before the revolution and why it was important to get the Shah out. Um, so let's talk about the early 70s, and this is one of the most fascinating stories that comes from Iran. Is 1971 and planning of this starts in the late 60s, but from October 14th through the 16th of 1971, Iran has this massive blowout party to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. This is the party of the century. I can't even think of anything that comes even close. You could say maybe the royal wedding of Charles and Diana, but it's not even that. No, nowhere even close. So the Shah wants to have a blowout party. Iran doesn't have like the hotel capacity to do uh, a big party like that. So he decides to honor the ancient beginnings of the party by holding the party in by the ruins of Persepolis. Um, they build this massive tent city there, and this is your pup tent out there on the Boy Scouts hanging out in the woods. No, this is luxury tents. They're I think they're plastic. They're not fabric or anything, um, but they put a ton of money, and it's reported to be like the estimate was 100 million at the time. The U.S. estimate was 100 million at the time, which is about 672 million in 2020 dollars. The French, who actually I actually trust um, their estimate because they were the most involved in actually putting it together. They doubled that to 200 million at the time. So that would have been 1.2 billion dollars for a 3-day party in the middle of the desert. Um, the finest French cuisine was served. It set several world records. One of which was the longest banquet table and the longest official state banquet ever. It was like 6 hours long or something like that. Um, but it was a massively, it was an impressive sight. They did the banquet. They also did a march of the Persian armies through the years. They went from the early years under Cyrus the Great, and they uh, up to the modern military that they've been buying from the United States. Um, it had 250 honored guests, and it was all heads of state or their world's monarchs, princes and princesses, queens and kings. The three oldest um, monarchs, well, at least lineages, were there. The Greek kingdom, the uh, Ethiopian kingdom, and the Iranian kingdom. And ironically, by the end of the decade, all three of them were gone. So, um, but other official representatives, the United States sent Spiro Agnew. Richard Nixon could not get security clearance to go to Iran for this, so they sent Spiro Agnew. Um, but few Iranians participated. Outside of the Shah and his wife, a few ministers that were involved in the actual planning of it that had to be there for that were there, and but it's an opulent blowout. But his people are there's a massive wealth gap in the country. So uh, you're a subsistence farmer in Iran, and you see the country spending the equivalent of 1.2 billion dollars on a 3-day party. You're going to get mad, and a lot of local people or a lot of Iranians got mad at it, and this really starts to sow the seeds of what's going on in Iran in the 70s. Um, but I will recommend to you, if you ever get a chance, go onto YouTube and just Google Persepolis celebration Iran. It's impressive to watch some of that stuff. Foreign media from all over the world were there to capture it. I mean, if you're going to spend $1 billion on a party, that you better have good coverage of it. So uh, Khomeini, he starts to get a little more active within Iranian politics. He sees the extravagant wealth being just plundered and destroyed on a 3-day party, and he calls it the Devil's Festival. And most people agree with it. There were, lots of un-Islamic things were happening. Gambling was going on there. Alcohol consumption was going on there. So he did have some legitimate gripes that resonated with the people, and he begins to take a more active role in Iranian society and Iranian politics. Um, but for the Shah, what starts to lead to his downfall is that he is diagnosed with lymphatic cancer in 1974. And I will say one thing for the Shah, he was an incredibly brilliant person. If you ever watched an interview with the Shah, he was very brilliant in, um, you know, what was ailing Iran, what was going on, and but he had hubris, and he becomes insular. He refuses to seek treatment or anything outside of Iran. He flies in French doctors in 1978, and they treat him with prednisone, which makes him uh, not really all that lucid. And he was unable to deal with what was going on with the revolution as it began to rage in 1978. He was in no condition to stop it. Um, I just looked at the time. I'm flying in this hour. So let's talk about the flashpoints of the revolution. So Khomeini was starting to send in cassette tapes with his sermons about the excesses of the Shah and how this was not good. And the Shah responds by having a newspaper article critical of Khomeini, calling him an Indian, calling him a homosexual, calling him drunk, and it backfired. Uh, the people in the religious city of Qom rallied to Khomeini's defense, um, and it really inflamed the passions. Another thing that happened was in August, there was a cinema fire in Abadan, Cinema Rex fire, killed about 420 people. It was blamed on the Shah's people, although there is evidence that has emerged that it was actually the uh, people loyal to Khomeini that did the fire, because they're yeah, the because the clerics don't like the idea of cinema representation of people, and so they there's a chance that there's a likelihood that they were involved in it. Black Friday, passions get inflamed, people are actually going out in the street and actually calling for the death of the Shah. And in response, the military fires on people in Tehran. Uh, Lots of differences in what happens, um, or what there's lots of differences in opinion on how many people died and how many people were injured in the clash. Anywhere from like 100 to almost 1,500 people were killed. Uh, the governments of the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, West Germany at this time, are very concerned, and they have a conference on the island of Guadeloupe, and just to talk about the Iranian situation. It's January 6th of 19. I got the wrong day there. 1979. January 6th, 1979. The Guadeloupe Conference has it, and this is the final straw for the Shah. The Shah sees the leaders get together to talk specifically about his country without inviting him or discussing it with him. So he decides to leave Iran for medical treatment. At this point, it's too late for him. He's stage four, way way beyond treatment. 2 weeks, and that's January 16th of 1979, not 76, it says here. And 2 weeks later, the Ayatollah returns, and we can talk about the hostage crisis. Um, I'm actually going to stop here because we're at 53 minutes. I was wondering what I was going to do for my next week's topic, but there's so much more to do with this. So we're going to stop for this. No sons. Are you talking about did the Shah have successors? He does have sons. He does have uh, people claiming to be, his. I think his wife. I don't know if she's still alive or just died. Um, but yes, the Pahlavi dynasty exists outside of Iran, and uh, I do know that his son is active on Twitter. I saw him tweet to Joe Biden recently, um, but they weren't old enough at that point to really take over the country and be strong. So we're actually gonna split this up. So next week we're gonna go over the second half of U.S. Iranian history. I wanted to keep this to an hour, and because it's easier to digest on the internet if you keep it to an hour. So, and I've got my other broadcast starting in a few minutes, but I want to thank everybody for taking the time to. We're going to pick it up right here with the hostage crisis and discuss what everything from 1979 on. It's a good natural breaking point. The Shah's left, the Ayatollah comes back, and we see what happens from the revolution on and how that impacts U.S. Iranian relations. Um, but I really appreciate everybody watching tonight. I invite you to stay tuned for the After Dark show. We have a new crew member, and Emily Hurtley is coming on. I'm excited about having new folks on and getting talking about the events of the week. We can talk about the stuff that I've discussed earlier tonight, and then next week we'll do part two of U.S. Iranian relations from the revolution on and discuss the future of U.S. Iranian relations. Thank you so much for joining me again, once again. I will talk to you guys next week for part two, and we'll see you guys on the After Dark show. All right. Have a great night, everyone.